Part 2. Day 2 of filming and probably day 6 of building. Spent the morning mucking around with these two springs. They're running off a axle. The orientation is the same as the belt, but it spins like this, not that way. So it's spinning this whole long axle here. The two springs are in the middle of it. The axle itself has got a fairly rough finish, it's not a high polish. The whole thing's out of a printer. I knew I couldn't use strings on this section because the bowing action is all wrong to do that, and I knew that springs would probably give me frequencies that I wanted. They're fairly high pitched. I'll just turn it on now. So it's on 6 volts right now. But it is, again, very similar to the stick slip principle of a horsehair bow, where you've got something that's being pulled with friction and then released very quickly. However, what's happening is that the springs are being pulled longitudinally and not horizontally. You can play around with the tensioning, you get different frequencies out of it. So I've only just adjusted that like 0.5 millimeter in its length. I've pulled it a bit tighter. So that's the big spring. You can hear what's coming in now. When I release that big spring, I get a high pitch frequency coming off the smaller spring. So this diameter is about, I don't know, 16 millimeters. This diameter here is probably about 6 millimeters itself. If I change the speed of the motor, which is here, I start to get a deeper frequency on this particular spring. And also I'm getting a higher harmonic on there as well. So that partial is really generated by a lot of friction. It's metal on metal. Now, this sculpture now represents an idea that I had approximately around 2006. And I was staying at someone's house in Tempe, a suburb of Sydney, for the Now Now Festival, and I believe it was around 2006. There were track works happening beside the house, and I was in a room right on the track. There were no trains running, there were just buses, but there was a lot of maintenance equipment working on the track. Now let's hear what it sounds like when the amp's on. It's even more interesting. So the position of the springs against the axle is fairly loose. There's not a lot of tension, and that's why they move up and down this way occasionally. It's almost like a feedback tone there. So eventually I'll make a whole video just about the machine working without me providing a narrative. I just wanted to make a video while I'm actually constructing the sound sculpture. So there's a big difference between the frequency structure of a string as opposed to the frequency structure that you find contained within springs. The way that springs vibrate are very different. So this one I'm getting a lot of longitudinal vibrations on both springs. I don't really get that, or you can't hear it when it's on a string unless you're using a long string like someone like Alan Fullman or Alan Lamb. And I really wanted these high-pitched tones to complement the other pulsations of the strings, because that was what I was hearing the night that I stayed next to the track maintenance works at Tempe. The location is very close to the old brickworks on the Pacific Highway, where a very famous industrial music gig was recorded by an Australian band, one of my favourite Australian bands, called SPK. So obviously there's something about that area that stimulates artists to work with these more industrial tones. Further up the track from the site in Tempe, there's a place where there's a lot of points where the train tracks from different lines converge, and there's this very bizarre area. There's a lot of big curves, and when the trains go around these curves, they made these kind of like squeaking sounds because it's the edge of the wheel rubbing up against the rail, and you get these friction tones. I think I'm going to call this sculpture Track Maintenance. I'm almost getting Alan Lamb-like tones there, which is a good thing. So at the moment it's mainly this one that's the narrower spring that's getting those tones. So if I lift it off, play around with the tension. So I've moved it up to 12 volts. I'm going to drop it back down to... Oh, I don't know what that was. I missed it. I wasn't looking. Got it on 9 at the moment. There's 12. Oh, I think it was the actual tuning bolt that just snapped back into position. Woo-hoo. That's really taken off. There's nowhere near the tension in the springs as what is required to make the strings really taut. So I'll bring it back, I'll put it on 6 volts, see what happens. It's a little less intense. I don't really care what the neighbours think. They're used to me by now. I've been living here for about 3 years. The sounds will be ringing out across the valley even though I've got the workshop doors closed. Nowhere near the sound atrocities that happen from the roadway. Just get that a little bit tight there on that bigger one. Right down to 4 volts. It's quite a slow speed there. So with the slower speed, as you've noticed, those high pitches are dropping off. This is really starting to wobble now, this bigger spring. The amp is directly behind the camera mic, so it's going to sound a little bit less direct. But I want to just see what happens when I adjust the height on the springs themselves from these tuning points, from the fixing points. There we go. So they're a bit higher up now. So I've changed the angle of how the spring is stretching over the central axis here. And the axle now is spinning fairly slowly. It's still on 3 volts. 4 volts actually. I'll wind it up. This is on the 6 now. Can't get through the video because you've got to grit your teeth at some of these high pitches, I understand. But at the same time, I don't care because I love it. 9 volts. Woo, it's opposed to being dominated by the longitudinal positions. That's really full on, isn't it? That's almost like pure feedback. You can hear me adjusting the mids, highs and lows on the amplifier, and it wasn't really making that much difference. It's mainly coming off this smaller spring at the top. It's like that intense feedback tone is just this thing, this very narrow spring. All the frequencies are generated from this one point where this horizontal moving shaft creates a longitudinal vibration up and down these springs. There's a lot of material in these springs because they're wound. If you were to stretch them out, they'd be much longer. They'd probably be about 5 times longer. They'd still have a resonance, but the harmonic structure would change because they're not in a coil. Change the tension, it changes the frequency, it all runs down to these 2 points. I can mute them with my fingers, and then from those 2 points it gets dispersed into this wide bar. And that's all steel. These are stainless steel. So long as I've got a big chunk of iron with a high ferrous content near the flux of the magnet and the coil, I'll be able to get over all the frequencies across the whole range that has been generated by the spinning axle. I was hoping to create something that had a little bit of flexibility, a mind of its own. Sounds are happening independently without me touching it. There's a lot of rhythmic phasing going on. There's a lot of looping going on. I don't know if you can see this spring here, but it is really oscillating right now. It's moving up and down, creating an optical illusion. It almost disappears. Part 3 coming up.